Have you ever felt like the more you care about someone, the further they pull away from you? Like you are standing in front of them with your heart open, but they are slowly stepping backward without even explaining why? And the strange part is, the more you try to fix it, the worse it gets. You text more, they reply less. You explain more, they understand less. You love deeper, they become colder. And at some point, you start asking yourself a painful question. What am I doing wrong? If this sounds familiar, then what you are about to hear is not just a message. It is a wake-up call for your emotional life. Because this pattern you are stuck in, it is not random. It is not bad luck. It is not because you are not enough. It is psychology. Human attachment works in strange but predictable ways. Some people move toward closeness when they feel love. But others, when they feel the same closeness, they start to feel trapped inside it. Not because they don't care, but because their nervous system sees emotional closeness as pressure instead of comfort. So what happens next is a cycle that destroys self-worth quietly. You move closer because you feel love. They move away because they feel overwhelmed. You panic and try harder, they feel even more pressure and pull further away. And without realizing it, you both create a silent emotional chase. But here's the part nobody tells you. The more you chase, the more your brain starts to associate love with anxiety. You stop feeling secure. You stop feeling calm. And slowly, you begin to lose your emotional center. You start thinking about them constantly. You overanalyze every message. You search for hidden meanings in silence. You begin to measure your worth based on their attention. And that is where the real damage begins. Because now it is no longer about love, it becomes about validation. And when love turns into validation, you stop being in control of your emotions. You start reacting instead of choosing. You start waiting instead of living. You start needing instead of loving. And the worst part is, the more unavailable they become, the more valuable they feel in your mind. This is how human psychology works. We are wired to want what feels uncertain. When someone gives inconsistent attention, your brain starts to treat them like a reward that is hard to reach. And anything hard to reach becomes more desirable, even if it is hurting you. So you stay stuck. Not because you are weak, but because your emotions are being pulled by a pattern you never learned to recognize. And while you are stuck in that loop, something important is happening in the background. You are slowly abandoning yourself. Your hobbies start fading. Your peace starts disappearing. Your confidence starts shaking. And your entire emotional world starts revolving around someone who is not even meeting you halfway. That is the silent cost of chasing someone who keeps pulling away. But here is something powerful you need to hear right now. You are not supposed to beg for consistency. You are not supposed to fight for basic emotional presence. And you are definitely not supposed to lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who keeps slipping away. Real connection does not feel like confusion every day. Real connection does not feel like anxiety in your chest. Real connection does not make you question your worth constantly. If it does, then it is not stability. It is emotional imbalance. And this is where everything can change for you. Because once you understand this pattern deeply, you stop taking their behavior personally. You stop assuming you are the problem. And you start seeing the truth clearly. They are not necessarily rejecting you. They are responding to their own emotional wiring. But here is the important shift. Even if their behavior comes from their psychology, your response comes from your power. And this is exactly where most people lose themselves. They try to fix someone who is not ready to be close. They try to prove love instead of choosing self-respect. They try to stay longer in situations that are slowly breaking their emotional balance. But the truth is simple. The moment you stop chasing, something inside you begins to return. Your clarity, your dignity, your emotional strength. And when you reach that point, everything you thought was love starts to look different. Not because love was fake, but because your perception was clouded by attachment anxiety. Now, before going deeper into this, there is something important. By the end of this journey, you will understand not just how this pattern works, but how to break it completely. You will learn how to stop giving your power away to someone who keeps stepping back. And more importantly, how to rebuild emotional control so your peace is no longer dependent on someone else's behavior. But to understand that transformation, you first need to see what you are doing right now that is silently keeping you stuck in this cycle. And that is exactly what comes next. What is actually happening in the mind of someone who pulls away the moment things start feeling close? Why does distance feel safer to them than connection, even when they care about you? To understand this, you need to step inside a completely different emotional world. Because not everyone experiences love the same way. Some people associate love with warmth, safety, and comfort. But there is another type of emotional wiring where closeness does not feel comforting at all. It feels heavy. It feels demanding. It feels like pressure building up inside the chest. This is what shapes avoidant behavior, and it is important to understand this clearly. Not to excuse it, but to stop taking everything personally. At the core of this pattern is a deep need for emotional independence. For these individuals, space is not a sign of rejection. It is a form of safety. When things become too emotionally intense, their system reacts by pulling back. Not because they do not feel anything, but because they feel too much at once. And here is where the misunderstanding begins. The person on the receiving end interprets that distance as loss, as confusion, as rejection. So they respond with more effort, more explanation, more emotional reaching. But internally, the other person is experiencing something different. They are not running away from love itself. They are running away from the intensity of emotional closeness that feels overwhelming to them. This creates a mismatch that slowly becomes painful for both sides. One side feels abandoned, the other feels suffocated. And without awareness, both start reacting in ways that increase the gap instead of closing it. There is a powerful psychological principle behind this. The human nervous system is designed to protect itself from discomfort. When emotional intensity rises beyond what someone can regulate, the instinct is to create distance to regain balance. For some individuals, that regulation system activates very quickly. So when emotional availability increases, their inner world becomes unsettled. They start feeling like expectations are rising, even if nothing has been said directly. They begin to sense pressure in situations where the other person is simply expressing care. And this is not logical thinking. It is emotional conditioning built over time. Often this comes from early experiences where closeness was unpredictable or overwhelming. So the mind learns a simple rule: stay independent to stay safe. That rule becomes automatic in adult relationships. But here is the part that hurts most. When someone like this starts pulling away, they usually do not communicate it clearly. Instead, they become inconsistent. One moment they are close, the next moment they are distant. One day they seem interested, another day they seem unavailable. This inconsistency creates emotional confusion in the other person. And confusion is powerful. It keeps the mind searching for answers. It creates mental loops. It makes you analyze small signals over and over again. You begin to look for patterns that explain the change. You replay conversations. You question your behavior. You try to figure out what shifted. And slowly, your attention moves away from your own life and starts centering around them. This is where emotional imbalance grows. Because now your internal state is no longer stable. It rises and falls based on their availability. When they are present, you feel relief. When they are distant, you feel anxiety. This cycle becomes addictive in a painful way. The unpredictability keeps your mind engaged, even when it is hurting you. And the more unpredictable it becomes, the more your emotional investment increases. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in human connection. People often assume that if someone pulls away, they must not care. But in reality, care and emotional capacity are not always aligned. A person can have feelings, yet still struggle with closeness. However, understanding this does not mean accepting emotional neglect. It simply means seeing reality clearly without distortion. Because once clarity enters, you stop building false expectations. And you stop trying to force stability from someone who is not internally stable in connection. At the same time, something very important happens to the person who keeps reaching. Their identity starts blending with the outcome of the relationship. Self-worth begins to depend on responsiveness, on attention, on consistency that is not actually consistent. And without realizing it, emotional control shifts away from them. They become reactive instead of grounded. They start adjusting their behavior constantly, trying to find the right version of themselves that will make the other person stay close. But there is no such version, because the issue was never about performance. It was about emotional compatibility. And here is the difficult truth most people avoid. You cannot regulate someone else's comfort with intimacy by giving more of yourself. In fact, overgiving often creates the opposite effect. It increases pressure in their system while decreasing your own stability. So both sides move further apart. One retreats to feel safe, the other pursues to feel secure, and the gap grows silently in the middle. But when you finally understand this mechanism, something begins to shift internally. You stop personalizing their distance. You stop interpreting every withdrawal as a reflection of your worth. You start seeing the pattern instead of the person. And that is where emotional freedom begins, because awareness breaks automatic reaction. Once you see the cycle clearly, you are no longer fully inside it. And that creates space for a different response. Not one driven by fear, not one driven by urgency, but one driven by self-respect and awareness. And this is where everything starts to change direction, leading into the next step of regaining control over your emotional energy and breaking the pattern that has been holding you back. Have you ever noticed how your mind starts to lose control when someone stops giving you consistent attention? How a single delayed reply can shift your entire mood for the day? How silence from one person can suddenly make everything else in your life feel smaller? This is where emotional dependency quietly begins to take over. Not in loud moments, but in subtle changes you barely notice at first. When someone becomes unpredictable in your emotional world, your nervous system starts adapting to that unpredictability. It begins scanning for signals. It becomes alert. It starts waiting. And waiting slowly turns into attachment. At this stage, your behavior begins to shift without conscious effort. You find yourself checking your phone more often. You start interpreting small actions as meaningful signs. You begin to adjust your time, your focus, even your mood around their presence. And the most important part is this: it does not feel like a choice anymore. It feels automatic. This is how emotional imbalance develops. Not through one big event, but through repeated small moments that condition your brain to prioritize one connection above everything else. And once that happens, your internal balance starts to weaken. Because your emotional center is no longer stable within yourself, it starts moving outside toward the behavior of another person. This is where confusion becomes powerful. When someone is warm one moment and distant the next, your mind struggles to find consistency. And the human brain hates inconsistency, so it tries to solve it. It builds theories. It creates explanations. It searches for hidden meanings. You start believing that if you just understand them better, things will settle. But emotional patterns are not solved through logic alone. They are driven by regulation systems that operate beneath conscious thinking. So, instead of clarity, what you experience is mental exhaustion. And slowly your focus begins to narrow. Things that once mattered to you start losing importance. Your energy gets redirected toward maintaining a connection that does not give stability back. This is how self-neglect begins quietly. Not through obvious choices, but through gradual prioritization of someone else's emotional state over your own life. At the same time, another shift happens internally. You begin to associate effort with value. The more you try, the more you believe the outcome depends on how much you invest emotionally. So, when things do not improve, you assume you need to try harder. This belief creates a dangerous loop because effort keeps increasing, but emotional return does not match it. And instead of stepping back, you lean further in. This is where exhaustion becomes emotional confusion. You are not just tired, you are mentally entangled in a cycle that keeps resetting itself. Every moment of distance makes you reflect more. Every small sign of closeness resets hope. And hope keeps you engaged even when the situation is not changing. This pattern can feel like emotional gravity. It pulls attention, time, and inner peace into one direction. And while this is happening externally, something more important is happening internally. Your sense of self starts to blur. You begin to define your emotional state through another person's availability. When they are responsive, you feel okay. When they are distant, you feel unsettled. And over time, this creates a conditioned response. Your mind stops asking, "How do I feel today?" and starts asking, "What is happening with them today?" That shift may seem small, but it changes everything because now your emotional system is no longer self-regulated. It is externally regulated. And anything that is externally regulated can easily become unstable. This is why emotional peace disappears in such dynamics. Not because you are incapable of stability, but because your stability has been tied to something unpredictable. And unpredictability cannot create security. It only creates anticipation. At this stage, even calm moments do not feel calm. They feel temporary because your mind is always waiting for the next change in behavior. And this waiting keeps your nervous system in a constant state of alertness. That is why you feel drained even when nothing is happening. It's because internally, a lot is happening all the time. Thought loops, emotional replay, silent expectation, subtle disappointment, repeated hope. All of it running in the background. And this is the point where most people misunderstand themselves. They think they are too emotional, or too attached, or too sensitive. But in reality, they are simply reacting to a system that has trained them to stay emotionally engaged with inconsistency. Once you see this clearly, something important starts to shift. You stop blaming yourself for feeling overwhelmed. You start recognizing that your emotional state is responding to patterns, not flaws. And when that recognition appears, distance begins to form naturally between you and the cycle. Not physical distance, but mental separation. You begin to observe instead of absorb. You begin to notice instead of react. And in that space of awareness, control slowly returns. Because the moment you stop feeding automatic responses, the cycle starts to weaken. And what once felt like emotional chaos begins to look like a pattern you can step out of. This is where real change becomes possible. Not through forcing outcomes, but through changing your position within the dynamic. And as this understanding deepens, the focus naturally shifts toward what it means to reclaim emotional authority and rebuild stability from within, without depending on external behavior to define your inner state. At some point, a quiet realization begins to form inside you. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. You start noticing that your emotional world has been shaped around someone else's behavior for too long. And in that realization, something powerful happens. You begin to feel the first signs of distance from the pattern that once controlled your reactions. This is where emotional control starts to return, not because the situation changes immediately, but because your response to it changes. You no longer move automatically when they shift. You pause. You observe. You think before reacting. And that small gap between feeling and action becomes your first real moment of power. Because emotional control is not about stopping feelings. It is about not being ruled by them. At this stage, something very important begins to unfold internally. You start reclaiming attention that was previously directed outward. Your thoughts slowly return to yourself. Your focus begins to expand again beyond one connection. Your energy stops being consumed by constant interpretation of another person's behavior. And with that shift, a deeper clarity starts to grow. You realize that you were not actually chasing a person alone. You were chasing emotional certainty. That feeling of stability. That sense of being chosen. That reassurance that everything is okay. But when that certainty was missing, your mind tried to create it through effort. And effort became attachment. Once you see it this way, everything looks different. Because now the situation is not about winning or losing someone. It is about regaining internal balance that was slowly given away. And this is where boundaries begin to form naturally. Not as a reaction, not as punishment, but as awareness. You begin to recognize where your emotional energy was leaking. And instead of filling every gap with effort, you start allowing space to exist. This space feels uncomfortable at first, because your mind was trained to fill silence with action. But now you resist that urge. You let silence remain silence. You let distance remain distance. And in doing so, you break the pattern that kept you emotionally reactive. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is emotional grounding, a state where your inner world no longer depends on constant validation. And as this grounding strengthens, something unexpected happens. The emotional urgency begins to fade. The need to check, analyze, and respond weakens. Not because feelings disappear, but because control returns to you. And when control returns, perception changes. You stop seeing every interaction as critical. You stop assigning meaning to every pause. You stop treating inconsistency as something you must solve immediately. Instead, you begin to see it as information. Information about compatibility. Information about emotional rhythm. Information about whether two people operate at the same level of availability. And this shift removes confusion, because confusion only exists when everything is interpreted personally. But when you step back and observe patterns instead of emotions, clarity enters. And clarity is powerful. It removes urgency. It removes overthinking. It removes emotional spirals that once felt uncontrollable. At the same time, your identity begins to strengthen again. You start reconnecting with parts of yourself that were ignored. Your interests, your goals, your personal direction, things that were once background noise, now start returning to focus. And as your identity rebuilds, dependency weakens. Because emotional dependence cannot survive in a life that is actively expanding. There is another important change that happens during this stage. Your tolerance for imbalance decreases. What once felt acceptable now feels misaligned. Not out of anger, but out of self-awareness. You stop negotiating your emotional stability for temporary connection. And this is where real transformation becomes visible. Because now, your presence is no longer shaped by uncertainty. It is shaped by choice. You respond when you want to, not because you are afraid of losing access. You engage when it feels aligned, not because silence feels unbearable. And this creates a completely different emotional dynamic within you. A grounded one, a steady one, a self-contained one. But perhaps the most powerful shift is internal. You stop looking for completion outside yourself. You stop expecting someone else's behavior to regulate your peace. And in that moment, emotional independence begins to form. Not as a concept, but as lived experience. You feel it in how you think, in how you respond, in how you carry yourself. There is less urgency in your actions, less noise in your thoughts, less emotional dependency in your reactions, and more presence in your own life. This is not detachment from feeling. It is detachment from dependency. And that difference changes everything. Because now, even if someone moves closer or further away, your internal state does not collapse. It remains intact. And this is the foundation of emotional strength. Not control over others, but control over your own inner world. As this stage settles, you begin to see something clearly. What once felt like a struggle for attention was actually a journey back to yourself. And that realization prepares you for the next phase. A deeper understanding of acceptance, release, and the ability to move forward without carrying emotional weight that no longer belongs to you.